No, it's on. Oh, there it goes. All right. Sorry. Delighted you're all here, and delighted those of you that are on screen are also here. It's become a cliche lately in the trade business to talk about the revolution in American manufacturing. Trade gets blamed for some of the changes in manufacturing, primarily job loss, even though that's probably more due to productivity improvements and technology improvements. But the two intersect. But the new debate, of course, is over the significant changes that are occurring in the way we make things and the kinds of things that we make. And this particular project here is related to advanced manufacturing, and in particular looked at additive manufacturing, which is otherwise known as 3D printing, which I think over the long term is going to revolutionize the manufacturing process. Think about the potential implications for the assembly line. And we'll probably have a story or two for you later on about how that's happening. It tracks some work the Scholl Chair has done in the past on advanced manufacturing technologies. We did a study on 3D printing specifically last year. We followed that up with one on blockchain. We'll probably be doing one in the future on some aspects of artificial intelligence. Because the nice thing about the Scholl Chair is it's not just about trade, it's about business, and it's about how the economic system is changing. And one of the things that we look at is the way that it changes workers and how workers are affected. So there's a whole bunch of things going on in the manufacturing sphere, but today we're not going to talk about most of those. We're not going to talk specifically about technologies. What we're going to do is talk about the skills gap. And that is the difficulty that manufacturers, particularly advanced manufacturers, are having finding qualified people to train or finding qualified people to directly hire to deal with much more sophisticated technologies and equipment than in the past. One of the mantras that we heard constantly that I think Charles will mention when he presents is that trying to deal with the image of manufacturing as old, noisy, and dirty, people would always say, this is not your grandfather's factory. And it isn't your grandfather's factory, but we clearly face challenges in getting people to understand that it's not their grandfather's factory, and that there's a lot of opportunities out there that are not only interesting, but which are career opportunities and pay very well. The genesis of this particular project came from a company who had exactly the problem I described, finding enough workers to meet its needs in advanced manufacturing, both for manufacturing the machines, but also in operating them. And what we did, and Charles is going to describe this, is a review of what kinds of programs existed in this country to address those problems, try to define the problem in greater depth than I'm doing right now, looking at different approaches and try to figure out what worked, what didn't work, and at the end of the day, what is the role of various instrumentalities, government, federal, state, and local, academia, and also private companies in trying to address the problem. I should note, by way of commercial, we have a second project underway in this same space that will be finished in a couple months that addresses not so much the skills gap, but the information gap. That is trying to deal with the problem of, depending on what month it is, 5 million jobs that can't be filled and 5 million people who are looking for work. And the people looking for work can't fill all of those jobs. The skill sets don't match necessarily, but we have not as a country done a very good job of helping people identify and find jobs that they are qualified for. So while today we're going to be talking about training and narrowing the skills gap to create a larger population of people that can undertake the jobs that are available, Come back and see us in September when we have another report that talks about how we can do a better job simply of matching people up and getting them the information they need to make informed decisions about professional opportunities for them. So today's program is we're going to present the findings of the report, our author is, and then we have a number of panelists who have helped us along the way through some private roundtables, build out and develop this report, and have been good about telling us when we were wrong and encouraging us when we were right. I will introduce them when they come up later on, but right now let me introduce our presenter. Charles Carson is a freelance consultant in the fields of labor statistics and data analytics in progressive politics. He has a decade of experience at the Department of Labor, including 7 years as an economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and 3 years in the Office of the Chief Economist as an analyst and advisor to the Secretary of Labor. He was a senior data associate at the Universal Services Administrative Company, where he helped build the company's first data analytics unit to better measure the effectiveness of $10 billion annually spent by the Universal Service Fund. Currently, he provides analysis and research as an author and contributor to reports and studies on the labor market, one of which is this. His most recent report, America's Workforce and the Self-Driving Future, with co-authors Erica Groshin and others, analyzed the possible labor market implications of autonomous vehicles. So we were very fortunate to have Charles not only do the analytical work, but to do some traveling and get out beyond the Beltway and actually meet with people that are engaged in the business of narrowing the skills gap. So with that, I turn it over to Charles, and then when he's done, several of us will come up here and have a conversation. Then we'll turn to you for questions.
Thanks, Bill. Thank all of you for joining me here and sharing the results of this report. I think it's a very exciting space that we are in right now, an exciting time to be talking about the changing dynamics in the manufacturing workforce, because I think a lot of those lessons learned actually apply beyond just manufacturing, but apply to the workforce writ large. So I want to move quickly through some highlights of what we've seen in our findings from this study, and then I want to get to our panel discussion. I'm excited to have that discussion talk about the nitty-gritty and the details and how we actually achieve these goals, and then hopefully get to some of your questions as well. So I'll go through a quick introduction of what we were looking at, some of the background findings leading into this, the actual findings and the research that we did, and the recommendations and conclusion that leads us to. So just sort of a background introduction of where the lay of the land is. Technology has been changing, and it's been changing for centuries. A century ago, 98% of Americans worked on farms. That's no longer true. And that doesn't mean that all those jobs were lost. It means that they had to change to new places, to new fields, and to new opportunities. 3 decades ago, a quarter of our workforce was in manufacturing. That's now down below 8%. That's a changing dynamic in terms of who's working where, but we actually produce almost 4 times as much stuff, measured dollar for dollar, as we did 3 or 4 decades ago. And so work is changing, and it's always been changing, but in the current environment, it's changing faster and faster. And so we need people who can respond to that and help adapt along with it. At the same time as the work is changing, employers' needs are changing. They need employees who can be that kind of adaptable and can respond as the market changes, can respond with that as well. And at the same time, we have an educational landscape in the US that is still very much baked into a pipeline that is feeding people into these kinds of jobs and feeding people into a strong setup for that. So with that background, our goal in this research was to try and think about what works in advanced manufacturing. And our study was really going to try and do a deep dive and look into the details of programs that are working well and having successes, and what are the things we can learn from that. And so we were not doing a broad survey, we were doing a sort of deep dive case study of a handful of programs outside of the district, but in this general Northeast manufacturing hubs region. And I think the biggest thing thing that I want to highlight is we do talk a little bit about the skills gap. And as an economist, I feel obligated to talk a little bit about the fact that economic theory says a skills gap is impossible. That in theory, the people who need a job and need a job done will pay enough that people who want to do that kind of work will meet that need. And in theory, the market should clear. Economists will usually just say, well, there can be a little bit of frictional unemployment or a frictional gap. But the reality on the ground, and as you get out there and talk to people, is if all we should see is friction, there's quite a bit of friction out there. In terms of how many jobs are currently unfilled because employers say they can't meet their current needs, and even looking forward decades into the future, even with all this churn, even with the new technology decreasing the total number of people who might be needed to produce an item of product, the changing skills needs are going to create millions of jobs that we need people who are training today to fill those jobs of the future. And so I think the challenge when we talk about a skills gap is, yes, it's sometimes just that friction of how do we get people who are currently in a place to the kind of skills that they can realize those gains. But it really is talking about where those mismatches are happening. And so I think we saw that a lot in our research and in the studies and in the people we talked to. So turning a little bit to the actual findings, the biggest thing that we heard over and over and over again was just a fundamental perception problem. And you could see this expressed in a number of different places. Like Bill mentioned, a common refrain, and I heard it from multiple people unprompted, was often, this is not your grandfather's or even your father's manufacturing. And I think the challenge that led to was often there was a school's pipeline so focused on trying to get people into college that anything that didn't go to college felt like a failure. And I think that was a perception that a lot of people were fighting against, and a lot of people who wanted to fill jobs were struggling with. I remember one person in particular, I think it was at our CBI in West Virginia, was talking about this great promising prospect that they had that had gone through some of their training programs, had started the beginnings of a pre-apprenticeship program. And he lamented the fact that he was like, well, he's such a great candidate, we'd love to have him on board, but gosh darn it, he decided to go to college instead. And they saw that as a loss. And the challenge I think we face is as these skilled manufacturing jobs of the future require such an interesting combination of different skills, frankly, a lot of people who are meeting those needs now will be enticed to continue on to college. And I think the challenge that a lot of these training institutions are meeting is finding ways to still meet those needs, to still meet that desire of workers to continuously improve as they continue their own employment and as they continue their own upskilling. So I think that was one of the biggest things that we felt and we found that was a challenge among the places that we spoke to. In fact, if anything, the most interesting, I think, finding from my perspective was we went in expecting that people would talk a little bit about techniques, or that we'd get data from various organizations, and one place might say, yeah, we have a 95% job placement rate, and this other place would say, oh yeah, well we have an 85% job placement rate, and we'd be like, okay, yeah, the 95% is better, we should study what they're doing. And the results we actually found was everybody had incredible job placement rates. They were almost indistinguishable. If anything, we found that people who left programs early often left because they were either snapped up into a job directly or were snapped up into other kinds of programs. The challenge was not job placement. The challenge was not the training itself often. The challenge was finding qualified applicants and finding people who could fit into the mold of what people needed looking forward. So I think that's speaks to sort of that ecosystem of how training and workforce development, and in particular how it's changing in the US as we speak. That there's a old model that says you go to school, you finish school. If you're going to a manufacturing program, you go to a vocational technical school, and then you get hired directly into an employer. And that model isn't working for a lot of people. And we heard that time and again, that from the employer side, that model doesn't work because the educational institutions just physically can't keep up with how fast their employer needs are changing. And then frankly, from the educational institutions perspective, you have students who either need a job now, need employment now, and are trying to find their marketable skills that can lead to that kind of employment. And so the programs we found that really were successful, the things that made them successful were how they got applicants. They developed good pre-apprenticeship programs that could feed a pipeline. They developed good relationships with their local employers that said, hey, we can connect you. We can serve as that glue that helps you find your employers. So we were expecting to find, sort of different types of training programs, and what everybody sort of leaned in on was the apprenticeship model, that was really finding that strong synthesis. Employers liked it because it allowed their skilled workforce to upskill, even for some incumbent workers. It allowed them to use that pre-apprenticeship setup and the collaboration with local educational institutions to serve as that feeder institution, feeding them qualified applicants who are upskills and can then work into the workflow. So those were the key findings, I think, that we really were surprised by when we went to these institutions. We weren't expecting that people said, yeah, the training part's not the hard part. The finding qualified applicants is the hard part. From the employer's perspective, it's not just that we want more skilled applicants. We need applicants who have both this math and sometimes even programming skill set, but then also know how to use a lathe and how to actually operate on a machine shop floor. That you've got to have a mind that is plastic enough to be able to be flexible and to be able to respond to the changing needs of the employer in real time. And teaching those kinds of skills, you don't learn that in a classroom. You learn that by doing, supplemented with that classroom information. So I think that leads to a few key recommendations that we talk about in the report. I think the first and the interesting one to me is often just how far down the educational ladder it was important to reach out to both students and their parents. So we found institutions that were not only hosting high school boot camps or high school age training seminars, but reaching down into middle schools, that they would take the 3D printers and use that as a mobile laboratory that they could take into the classroom, because ultimately we've got to get students excited about this. They have to see for themselves the touch and the feel of what you can create and how that can open up your own creativity and allow you to have a job that's fulfilling your own personal goals, but also is a realistic career path forward. And the thing is that created a virtuous cycle. In the places where you saw that happening, you saw that, okay, students are realizing that they're going to still need a focus on STEM education, on those math and science skills, but it's not just because you need that for a college education. You need that because that's other skill sets that you're going to want to use going forward as well. I think the other half of it, we talk about the pipeline of new students and new people coming in, but I think there was a real challenge we heard from a number of our study participants in upskilling the current workforce. And for an existing employer, on the one hand, you want your workforce to be skilled. On the other hand, if you're already running a very lean operation, where do you find the time? How do you, get your workers extra, training on the new technology, on the new things, if they're already working, overtime shifts all day, all night? And so we heard from a lot of employers that there was a struggle sometimes to get their own workers into incumbent lifetime learning programs. And frankly, a lot of them felt like there was a concern that there would be poaching, or that, if I help train up my own workers, they're going to want to leave and go to another place. And that said, in the workers and the employers we found that actually did focus on their workers, not only did the programs often have returns directly to that employer, in part because there was a requirement that you would stay with that employer, but when we spoke to individual employees who felt like their company was investing in them, they felt a stronger obligation to invest back in that company. And so it really created a bond between the employer and the company. And I think that's something that we've seen the beginnings of a loosening, that the millennial generation is on average probably going to have more jobs over the course of their lifetime and more different employers than the previous two generations, where it was common to spend your entire career with one employer with exactly, frankly, one job. And I think that's not the way the future is looking. But even for an employer, the fear of poaching, if anything, training your own workers reduces that, fear of people wanting to go away. I do think the other half of that challenge for employers themselves, though, and we heard this from a couple of different places, was there was a concern that there's a weird and confusing web of different places where funding and money and education can happen. And so I think that's a place where we talk a little bit about where local governments and local community organizations can really fill that gap and be the glue that pulls those things together. One of the interesting things that's been somewhat of a recent development is that educational institutions can now actually be certified to operate an apprenticeship program. So they can somewhat take away the burdens of the paperwork and the scary sides of forming a registered apprenticeship from employers and highlight how simple that is, and then take on a little bit more of those burdens so that the employer can focus on just training their workers and focus on just producing what they're producing, and can sort of offload some of the more burdensome paperworky parts of that to other places and other institutions. I will say the other interesting thing that we found was almost every place we went to had a makerspace. And there was some interesting commentary that we heard from different people on this. I think I heard from a couple of people, well, we have this space, but we really don't know what it does. And in contrast, there were some people who said, oh yeah, we love our makerspace. It's a business incubator. It does all these things. But it really doesn't pay a return on investment. And in fact, a fairly large company that operated a bunch of makerspaces in the US went bankrupt about a year or so ago now. But where we saw makerspaces being most successful was where it created that feedback loop, or it reinforced, for people across the spectrum, from young people who were coming in for some of these, high school and even middle school boot camps, they could see something happening on this, new modern factory floor, and it could inspire them. And so where we see the makerspaces sort of fitting in to this ecosystem, where they work the best is where they're feeding into that same feedback loop, where they're inspiring people, where they're helping develop the next generation of people who can see, oh, hey, yeah, I can use this 3D printer to draw a skull, but now what can I do next? And so then you can open up that creativity, and then you get both that combination of the tactile learning, hands-on, seeing what you can build, and then opening it up to the possibilities of what your imagination can lead to. So I think those are the key highlights I wanted to talk about. I know we have an esteemed panel that we wanted to chat with and talk a little bit more. So, Bill, I guess I can turn it back over to you.
Panel will come on. Like a seat?
Okay, I'll go all the way here.
I'll sit on the ends. Fill in. Oops, careful.
There was another step there.
It always catches you.
I don't really want to sit in the center. Charles, do you want to sit in the center?
Say what? No, the end is good for me.
Well, thank you for that, Charles. And I should tell everybody, you should all have one of these things. If you don't get one, we'll get you one on the way out. I should say this is a summary. This is not the whole thing. But as appropriate for the 21st century, we're not going to print the whole thing. It's available electronically. So if you want the full study, you can go on to the Scholl Chair website and see it there. But we do have a short version that we want you all to have. It's a real honor for me to be with this panel and to introduce them. You've met Charles already, working my way in this direction. Next over is, and I'm not going to do full bios, I'll just do titles, but Camille Caron, who is the Director for Education and Sustainability for 3D Print at HP. And I should say in process, we are very grateful to HP for its support of this project. They are in this business and have been very helpful to us in both supporting the project and providing us advice going forward on the whole thing. So I'm very happy that Camille's been able to join us. Next we have Jerry Fiala, who is currently an independent consultant and also serves as of counsel to Capitol Hill Partners. Previously, she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Employment and Training for the Department of Labor and was responsible for a number of important elements there, including the department's implementation of, I don't know how to pronounce the acronym. It's the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. What did you say, WIOA? Or just,
WIOA.
You just said WIOA. You don't. When I was on the Hill, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out pronounceable acronyms. That was it. Anytime you were going to create a new entity, you wanted to make sure that they could, so you could pronounce the thing.
It's a lost art.
And finally, next to me is Josh Kramer, who is the Education and Workforce Director at America Makes, which means he's one of the people that is actually on the front lines of providing training and helping companies solve their problems. The panel is appropriately chosen because we have one person who, as I said, is in the middle of actually the doing of this. Jerry, I'm going to say, is our government rep. She's not our government. She's not in the government anymore, but she can speak from the government perspective, and Camille can speak from the private sector perspective of the manufacturer who's encountering these problems. And Charles, of course, knows everything. So between them, I think that we've got a good group. We will talk for a little while, and then we'll turn it over to you all for questions. Let me start by picking up on something that Charles said and asking you guys to comment on if you want, and that is his comment was the biggest problem was finding qualified applicants. So why is that, and how do we solve that particular piece of the problem? Anybody want to venture a comment?
I can jump in there.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and so I can share a little bit about our experience at NCDMM and America Makes. And so one of the things that we find is the perception, and you hit on that, within the early presentation. And so the perception of manufacturing is different. There's a couple great studies that point to a child, a young boy, young girl, decides if they like math or science in 2nd or 3rd grade. And so if we're not doing those things very early in inspiring children of the opportunity, we have a great opportunity in additive manufacturing because the technology has become very accessible, meaning that you can have 3D printers in elementary classrooms. My wife does as a 3rd grade teacher. And so introducing them to a technology allows that high-tech kind of cool factor to manufacturing. And so we talked about advanced manufacturing. There are a lot of advanced manufacturing techniques that have a great cool factor. And so it's introducing them. But when you look at some of the studies that are done, there are 4 main factors that a child decides manufacturing's for me. Number 1 is a dynamic experience for themselves. So they have to experience a really great experience that says, wow, this is a great career opportunity. Number 2 is mom and dad. Number 3 is a champion at school. And number 4 is a peer. And so by creating well-rounded opportunities to meet those 4 needs is a great opportunity for us to introduce these students. But we have to start early enough that we widen our funnel so that when we get to the end of that funnel, we have enough people in a pipeline that enter programs for training as well as the academic side.
So even earlier than middle school?
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just going to add that not only do I agree, but I think what was just said articulates the need for the partnership between business and government, in this case, the public schools, from a very young age. I think that, you talk about the ability to become excited, but part of that is knowing what's out there.
Absolutely.
And if employers aren't actively engaged in helping to tell that story, both to parents as well as instructors and guidance and career counselors, it's not going to get to the students very readily. And in schools where they're less resourced, it's even more of a challenge.
Yeah, I'm going to answer this from a couple of different angles. One is sort of what we're looking for both at HP as a manufacturer ourselves, as well as some of that pipeline comments that we've already heard. I think the challenge that we have with some of the roles, and I'll say we're faced with this as well ourselves too, is looking for an interdisciplinary approach that has an innovative spin to it. So it's not just, this is my job, this is my operations, this is how I run things. There's a change management element to that that is often missing in a skill set, those soft skills. When I think about how that translates into education, going from higher education all the way down into grade school, again, it's the schools that are really where we're starting to see traction are the ones that are bringing together the engineering department with the industrial design, with the business students, and creating these interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary opportunities. Often the makerspace is where those disciplines meet. And so how to create some of that traction to really get those different types, the different cognitive skills pulled together. Because what we're seeing in additive manufacturing is it's not just about how things were made before. It really is how is it going to change for the future. And so I would say that innovation piece is certainly something that's required.
Well, and I think going back to something Josh said, particularly for kids, I think the cool factor is important. And 3D printing is cool.
Yes.
Robotics is cool too. I mean, these little things running around doing battle with each other, and the opportunity to design and make those things is just interesting, and it's cool on multiple levels. When we released our report last year on additive manufacturing, we began with the story of a guy in, I guess, Texas, who had printed a house. And I thought, well, that's really kind of outside the box. You don't think about printing houses, but you can do that, and that's the product of imagination, I think, and creativity, marrying the technology and developing whole new applications that people hadn't thought of. I mean, a lot of it is not houses, it's smaller things, some of them enormously complicated, like jet engine components that require a very sophisticated process. I mean, a lot of people think of you go in and make little trolls that you put on a keychain, but that's where it began. But it's way beyond that now. But getting people interested in a hands-on way. I mean, I think Charles' point about the maker spaces was exactly what you said. This draws people in and says, look, here is this thing you can do, and then you have to build on that. And you talked about the other elements of that. Jerry mentioned the partnership idea, or the working together idea, which is one of our conclusions. Let me ask you a related question, which is, I wonder if we have too many partners or too many actors. So we've got federal programs, we've got state programs, we've got local programs, we've got businesses, we've got colleges, we've got community colleges, we've got America Makes and organizations like that. We've got regional workforce boards. We have all these different people out there, each doing different pieces of the puzzle. Is that too many? Does that make it more complicated than it could otherwise be? Is there an argument to be made for a more centralized approach? Anybody have a thought?
I think the challenge is twofold. That if you have a top-down approach, fundamentally it's not going to meet the needs of actual employers. And I think that was a concern you heard across a number of people, a number of institutions were worried about too much of a heavy-handed top-down approach from the federal government in particular, could actually stifle that innovation and stifle the ability to build those kinds of networks. But where I do think the federal government in particular can lead, and this came out of a couple of our roundtables, was the federal government fundamentally is one of the biggest employers in the US, especially once you add in some of the work that the military in particular is focused on right now. The federal government, I think, has a great role that it can use as sort of a leader in its own workforce and sort of drive innovation by saying, here's what works for us, and then open up the opportunities to other institutions and to other boards to take and follow on and develop and be creative within that. I feel like, Jerry, you're obviously an expert in that intersection as well. So
I was just going to say, number one, I think that's true, and I think the federal government has made attempts to actually begin to implement the apprenticeship program, for example, as it's hiring new people. I think also, you mentioned in the report, the need to figure out how to sort of collaborate or coordinate these various bodies. Each has different resources, each brings some expertise to the table, the conversation table. And under, for example, you mentioned, Bill, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. It's really not that's a decentralized program. So it's really states who create plans, but they turn over a lot of decision-making to the local areas, either workforce areas or regional areas, which are chaired by business and with a business majority. And it's that particular body that funds and can coordinate for businesses around the area.
When you were doing that, what kind of cooperation did you get from state and local governments?
They were actively engaged, in both commenting as well as helping to develop the concepts. And I think, that was a bipartisan effort by Congress to create that legislation. And we were simply there to figure out how to implement it. And there were hearings all over the country and lots of active input. One of the major things that it can fund is it can help employers do work-based learning, on-the-job training. It can fund pieces of the apprenticeship program. It can fund pre-apprenticeship programs to help people qualify, both youth or adults, to enter the program. And there are also funds there to help employers train their current workers to upskill and retrain. So there's a lot of pieces in there that I agree that people don't know. And so there has to be a better job that I think is done by state and local governments and the federal government to talk about the resources available to be able to help people qualify and get the credentials to get the jobs or the promotions.
And I would say,
I wanted to ask you, you have government clients as well as others.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, I think that's where the federal government has shown some leadership in that space. So when you look at an organization like ours, Public-Private Partnership, American Makes is a National Innovation Institute for Additive Manufacturing. So we literally are supported by the Department of Defense, Office of Secretary of Defense, but that public-private partnership. So we have members and partners like HP that we engage with at a very intimate level, assessing their needs, assessing their wants, as well as the defense sector, and then building those programs to tailor. One of the things that we're going through right now is the validation of those things. So we're able to sit as the national entity that then can piece together those local entities. We have several programs where we can deploy a national strategy to meet local scope and impact, because that's ultimately what solves the problem, is that local engagement. And so our goal is to create a properly vetted, we have a great education workforce development committee, we have an executive committee, to properly vet these programs, but basically to launch a toolkit so that local employers can tailor and fit those to their needs. When we talk about apprenticeships, for example, the first formal and actually only additive manufacturing technician apprenticeship that was formally launched last year, we validated that through our membership, both of defense and industry. We're working on one right now with the Urban Institute out of DC for maintenance technicians specific to additive manufacturing. We're hearing that from the voice of our membership, the voice of our stakeholders, and so we can build that toolkit, that toolbox that our local manufacturers can utilize. Say, here are the best practices. We validated those for you, and then we can assist in that and kind of be that conduit that connects to whether it's a state government, a local workforce board, a local MEP, wherever those channels may exist, and obviously the resource that comes with them, as well as the academic institution pathways and those types of things, just the same way.
Can you give we were talking earlier, so I'm going to repeat the same stupid question that I asked him earlier, which was, I ask a lot of stupid questions, which is, tell us a little bit about what you actually do for an agency like the Department of Defense. I don't usually think of them as a manufacturing entity. So give us an example or two.
Yeah, and I think the important thing there is, to look at some of the problems that need solved for the Department of Defense, but looking at the industrial base that supports the Department of Defense. And so when you look at the supply chain, there are a large number of defense contractors, defense manufacturers, folks and civilians that work for defense as well. And so our goal is to engage in a very, like I said, a very intimate way, closely with our DoD partners to identify what those problems we can help them solve. Obviously, we do that on a technical front, whether that be a technology, a process, a material, but doing it on the educational workforce development side is just as important. And so we have an entire roadmap that maps those, what we would call requirements, which, think of those as the problems we're solving for the Department of Defense. But many of those are the same intersects that would engage with a corporate or an industry stakeholder. Because they're seeing the same issues. And so how we deploy those, working closely with them, and then aligning that to a technology roadmap so that our workforce develops at the same pace with the technology does. So we're trying to eliminate that gap just the same, because we know that, and there was a great study that actually was supported by HP done last year that talked about literally half of the skill sets in the next 10 years will not be there. So if we train for what we need today, we're actually, half of those skill sets won't be in existence 10 years from now. So it's very important that we're having the conversations with our industry partners, our industry stakeholders, our Department of Defense partners, to really take a deep dive into what are those knowledge pieces that you need someone to know, what are the things you need someone to actually be able to perform, and those tasks, and then how do they interact with one another. I think that's the soft skill piece that Camille talked about, just the same.
And I was just going to add one thing where I think, tops down versus bottoms up. Access. I come back to the makerspace example. Makerspaces are great when you think of the desktop machine, some of the easy access to the early on-ramp to the equipment. Where it starts to become more challenging, and I think you brought this up, Charles, with the large tech shop being an example of a chain that basically the business model couldn't play out. So how can we create programs that really do play that matchmaker between industry and these programs and provide that access to the industrial level equipment? Because there's one thing to create small little pieces that are on a desktop system. What we encounter at manufacturing and all of that with the supply chain that you just mentioned, from sort of the parts through assemblies and beyond, that really is stitching together a lot of different pieces. And if you don't have access to those systems to understand what they do, it's very hard to prepare, to educate, and to design for. And so I think in connecting the dots, how do we make sure that the funding is there, to be honest? Because a lot of the schools I speak to say, love the technology, would absolutely like to have it on site. How do I get it here? And so I think that's one very pragmatic area that we can look at.
Is this a question of funding not being available, or of them not knowing where it is and how to get it?
I think it's that. One of the things that we're looking at is how do we teach folks, well, basically how to fish, right? where to find it, what are the programs, what's available. You don't know what you don't know. And so in trying to, I don't know if it's not just not available, but how to make it simple. And you called out some of the bureaucratic sort of paperwork processes, and where MEPs and local agencies could also help. And I think that, yes, that could definitely clear a path.
I think knowing that America Makes exists, and we're here to help exactly that.
Yeah.
Well, and I think there needs to be a much better job to communicate what the workforce development boards do at the state and the local level with employers and so on. Each of the local or regional boards has on it community colleges, business, obviously a majority, and others. But clearly, within the region, it's great to have national information, and it's great to have national models, but how do you take those down within the state to regions and localities so that schools and businesses and the supply chain within the region, they also know and can work forward to put together plans to be successful in their own areas. And that's a real challenge, and that makes it, it's local.
Yeah. And how do you make them at the end of the day, I spent some of my career working as a consultant, working with small and medium businesses. They have smaller budgets, they have big dreams, but they have very real connections to probably, the folks that are on their payroll. And so how to drive change within those organizations and really help them, at the end of the day, be rock stars to support their employees, their community, and their neighborhood, and really bring it back to what they're trying to accomplish.
Well, that was one of the things that the study learned. Maybe, Charles, you can elaborate a little bit more than you did in your presentation about the differences between SMEs and big companies and the particular problems that small companies encounter.
I think that was definitely a challenge, and we saw different areas address it in different ways. I think some of the places we visited, we're lucky to have a very large employer who could, sort of be just the big mover and create an ecosystem around them. I think we saw that in particular with some of the things happening around the Siemens plant down in South Carolina. And, they obviously take a very German apprenticeship model. What was interesting to see, especially in that locality, was because they came in and said, we want to collaborate with this community college, and then other smaller businesses were able to come on board and sort of follow their lead. And so it created some really interesting opportunities for both, pre-apprenticeship opportunities that functionally, from my perspective as an outside observer looking in, looked like almost an extended interview process where the interview sort of brought in people, allowed them to start working on a smaller scale through the community college in that environment, and then move on to where they were the best fit. And so Siemens would take a few of the pre-apprenticeship candidates into their full apprenticeship program, but then other pre-apprenticeship candidates would also go into other programs in that community to other even smaller businesses. I do think the biggest challenge that I heard from, especially when we spoke to the small businesses in particular, is they just sometimes either don't have the time or don't have the resources. Like when you're already a small business and you're a small shop, you're already working so hard on just getting the product out the door that sometimes you don't feel like you have the time. And if you don't already have that established relationship, you're not going to realize what you don't know and how much that actually could benefit you. I think there was a great example, I believe this was in West Virginia at RCBI, where there was a local employer who, I won't name, but makes the Christmas tree stands. And had a problem with
Christmas trees, you mean the thing is
the little plastic thing that you put your Christmas tree in, right? And had a problem where the mold for that overheated. And frankly, just because one of their employees just had a working relationship and was friends with one of the staff at RCBI, were able to get together and sort of collaborate on, actually, I can 3D print the mold and do things that you didn't realize that just milling a mold down, I can make more space for it to cool, I can do these other creative things with it. And basically, I think they said doubled the speed of their output because they didn't have to have downtime while the machine cooled down. And it was one of those things that, because they're a small shop, I mean, they make Christmas tree molds among other things, like that's not the only product they make, but they were always busy and focused on just getting the output, and they didn't have time, and frankly didn't feel like they had a big enough staff to be able to sit back and say, what can we do? And having that collaborative relationship with a local institution, with somebody who had worked across different employees, worked with different places, allowed them to have that creativity and say, hey, we can help you out here. And so they're in a really lucky spot because they have a good working relationship with their local workforce boards. They have that maker space that people can sort of rent time on. And then frankly, they have people who are just sort of passionate about, yeah, we know that not every project's going to lead to a moneymaker for me as an institution, as RCPI, but we're okay with that. We have grant funding. We'll figure it out on our end. We want to be that glue and be that successful, incubator for the ideas in our region. And so they really took that approach, and you could see it in the kinds of relationships they had with those small employers.
But that's kind of, in that example, that's kind of random. It happened because of a relationship between two people that was just conveniently there. How do you institutionalize
I think it seems random when you talk about that one story, but when you see the way that that institution really like actively reaches out to the employers in their area and maintains those relationships, when you're maintaining that many relationships and reaching out across that many places, what seems random actually starts to become common. Because that was not the only story that they had. That was just, I thought, the more interesting one to me. But they had other collaboration work that they had done with the hospital in Charleston. They'd had other collaboration that they'd reached out to various other places you wouldn't even think that, hey, an additive manufacturing or a little bit of a technique here could help. But because they were actively reaching out to pretty much everybody they could in their region, they were able to build those relationships. And I think that was, if you increase your sample size large enough, even things that are random start happening with regularity.
I would just add to that, having been in several of the one-stop centers that were mentioned in the report, one of the things that they all seem to have is a business services representative section. And I think it particularly benefits small and medium-sized, very small and medium-sized businesses. So there is an institutional avenue which I have seen activated in various spots for manufacturing, small niche manufacturers and suppliers to those companies. So I think part of it, again, is an education process and an aggressive approach on the part of the one-stop centers, if you will, to reach out to business. But part of it also is, I think, for business to take a leadership role in some of that activity as well.
Yeah, and I was just going to say the workshops. This is where the training comes in. And this is what Josh is working on. This is what we're doing at HP with 3D printing and digital manufacturing. How do we help executives understand the economics decisions of choices? So again, you can influence from multiple perspectives, whether it's a small company or a large company. That discovery of which parts should be reconsidered and how could you find savings further down the road by consolidating things together, lightweighting, or even just improving the molds for injection molding ultimately down the road. There's a lot of shifts and changes, but I think our challenge is trying to find the right venues to be able to scale that training. We do a lot of the workshops. We go out to the schools. Every time we have an event, we do something we call Design for Additive Manufacturing training. But how do we start to bring that to scale collectively across our organization?
And I would add, one of the things that we're very cognizant of is making sure we're bringing rigor with that, right?
Yes.
So when we talk about things like maker spaces, how do we add rigor to that so that there's a big value add on a maker space? It's not just a place where I came and I made this little widget. And so, launching things, and we're working on a number of projects around that, but launching things like digital badges that fit in perfect in a makerspace. They're micro credentials. One of the things that we talk a lot about is kind of an American-made superhighway that allows folks to on-ramp and off-ramp. And with today's, and we were talking about this, ahead of the panel, but with today's lack of attention, right? It's, folks don't want a full 4-year degree or a 2-year degree, and some do, some don't, but they need what they need right now, and they want to access it right now to attain it quickly. So, some folks may on-ramp, get what they need, and they may off-ramp, but they want them to be able to come back and on-ramp again. And so we're building that pathway from, and again, specific to additive, but building that pathway from what is 3D printing to I'm an expert in 3D printing, and how do I get there? What are my stair steps? What are my resources? What are my industry recognized credentials that will allow me to walk into an employer, and this is both sides. I think we've heard about this today, is they don't know what they don't know. But making sure employers know these resources are out there so that when someone comes in and they say, oh, I'm actually certified as an additive technician. What does that mean? What are they actually getting? What are they hiring? And so working on both sides of that equation is very important, but I think making sure that we have rigor in that training scale. And that's something that we even work with the Department of Defense on. How do we bring industry standard, industry recognized piece even to military training, whether that's current warfighter, active military, as well as separating veterans into the workforce.
And I think that frankly is why registered apprenticeship keeps coming up in all of the conversations, because the ultimate of a registered apprenticeship, if you've successfully completed, is a credential that's recognized by industry, that's portable, and has the quality to do that. And I think employers who, despite the paperwork to register, there is an expectation there that they will know what this person can do if they have that certificate. And frankly, it's also to the advantage, which we've not mentioned at all, to the workers who, if they relocate or they need to change direction, they have something that can articulate the skills that they can demonstrate. So it's a two-way street.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Let's, you said the magic word there, which is apprenticeship. Let's spend a few minutes on that specifically, because when we went into this initially, we had planned to focus on community colleges, relationships with companies like Siemens who go in and say, this is what we need, can you design a program that will do that? Or other kinds of institutions that provide training. And we were told by virtually everybody that the apprenticeship approach is a better one for closing the gap. And so we ended up devoting a significant part of the study to apprenticeship specifically. And I guess I'll give you an example, but the question I'm heading toward is that really the right answer? And I ask it partly because in the other project that we're doing that will be out in a couple of months, in the process of talking about the information gap, we came across a study that was done in Germany of the apprentice program in Germany, which, to be fair about it, is controversial and not everybody agrees with it. But essentially, it was a study that concluded that apprenticeship programs provide advantages to younger workers in the beginning of their careers because they train them specifically to do what it is that needs to be done, whatever that is. But it puts them at a disadvantage 20 or 30 years later because the training is relatively narrow, and as you were saying earlier, the technology is going to evolve in ways that are hard to predict, and they end up being less prepared later on, even though they are more prepared in the beginning than people who had had a more general education, whether it's college or associate degree, who go in the beginning less prepared, but are better able to cope with changes 20, 30 years down the road. Is that right? Are we putting all of our eggs in the wrong basket, or many of our eggs in the wrong basket?
What I would like everyone to consider and think about is the ladder effect to that, right? Saying everyone's in the apprenticeship bucket, I think is not the best approach. The best approach is to say that could be the capstone, right, for those students. But I think having a ladder where students can literally take step by step. Maybe they start with the digital badge and then receive an industry recognized credential in some subset. It allows them to navigate that career pathway. If you take a student who loves math and they say, wow, I'm going to start with coding, and they receive an industry credential in coding, and then through that they find something like additive, and they say, wow, here's where I can actually add, and they say, well, what's additive? And then they find this thing called subtractive, and now it's, I can write code for a CNC machine. That allows them to navigate that interest. It also allows us to create, even at the bachelor's or PhD level engineers that have a very hands-on approach to their education versus that all-in apprenticeship focused on that one thing. So I think having that multitude of allowing those students, and again, I'm talking students that start early, allowing them to kind of take that laddered approach. And I think obtaining that journeyman card of an apprenticeship program is fantastic.
Journey worker.
A journey worker, of course. But I think that's again an ultimate goal. But I want to make sure that we keep a wide lens for these students so they don't narrow that focus.
The one thing,
I was just going to add to that. When you think about apprenticeship, which is work-based learning, there are many different kinds of work-based learning, from cooperative education in universities where you learn some practical skills. But going back to apprenticeship, the beauty of it is many of these apprenticeship programs now are looking for a broader set of skills because they're finding their apprentices in their companies, manufacturing companies. They have clients in those companies. they have other parts of other divisions, other units and so on. They have to be able to communicate and solve problems and so on. So you're seeing some broadening in the design of registered apprenticeship programs. They're not static. But number two, there is an agreement between a number of community colleges and the apprenticeship sponsors and the companies that successful completion can be awarded a certain number of credits in a college. And that college credit then allows that individual the flexibility to do exactly what you're talking about, Josh, to kind of go on and off ramp to continue to build this lifelong learning process to get either additional credential or stackable short-term credentials along a career path.
I want to build definitely on what you said about lifelong learning being kind of the key here. I think we have a perception that apprenticeships are just what you do when you are the brand new green worker. And that is very much not the case. And when you talk to the institutions that are really, focused on that and focused on the apprenticeship program, they don't want to be in that place where somebody's trained and then set free and never gets training again. Right. And so they really talk a lot about, even for your small businesses, how upskilling your incumbent workforce can provide, returns directly to you. And so you don't have to think about apprenticeships just in terms of the new hires and the new people, but you can have, even somewhat senior workers who then can continue on that training path and wherever that path leads. And I think, to that particular study, I think that is frankly the challenge that Germany is facing, is that it's not, there needs to continue, that continued investment needs to keep going. Because from my perspective, after speaking to a lot of these programs, the flip side of that is if you go away from an apprenticeship and a collaborative model, you can end up in a place where, school curricula are set based on what was popular 10 years ago, which isn't even relevant for today and is going to have zero relevance 10 years in the future. And so I think the programs that seemed to be the most successful were the ones that took that collaborative approach, said we can bring things together, and it's not just a finish your apprenticeship and you're done. This is the start of a lifetime package.
Charles, was it fair to say also that they continually evaluated those programs to get feedback to make sure that the credentials and certifications were in demand? I mean, I think you have to add that.
I love evaluation. I think evaluation is one piece that we talk about a little bit in our report, that I think that is a place where especially the federal government can have a big role in making sure that the federal government resources can look after and make sure that these programs are meeting goals and meeting targets and actually providing value. And that we can do that from a number of different ways, of whether it's evaluation studies that look broader and look around at programs that are successful. I don't want to create too many requirements. I think that gets too close to that top-down approach that a lot of people feel doesn't necessarily respond to local needs on the ground. But finding that balance and being a leader, and then finding ways to evaluate and say, is that actually paying a return on investment? And here's where it's being successful and here's where it's not, is I think a critical role that the federal government in particular can fill.
Okay, let me touch on two more things, and we'll turn it over to you all. The first one is related to what we've been just talking about, and something that Josh said way back in the beginning, which is basically that it sounds like technology is moving faster than education, and that things are changing fast. This is a community college issue, among other things. Things are changing faster than our educational system can keep up with. So that suggests we are not ever training people for what they're going to have to be doing 10 years from now or 15 years from now. Do we just have to live with that, or is there some solution to that problem? I don't think we can slow down the flow of technology, but I don't think we want to.
I think that's where it comes back to the soft skills you were talking about.
Yeah, and I would say, when I talk to deans of engineering schools and whatnot, I think the common thought is, how do I stuff more into these kids' heads in 4 years, and are we actually teaching them the right thing? And I think I'm paraphrasing, but that's literally what they say. There's ABET accreditation. They're looking at, do we have enough digital? Do we have enough computer science attached to this engineering right now? There's a lot of activities that are going on, but to your point, I don't know if we'll be able to keep up so much as make sure we continue, like what we see in the medical field and in other areas, continuing ongoing educational requirements. Maybe that's the better direction than trying to stuff everything in those first four. I don't know about you in the room, but I've been working for longer than I would want to say. And I think back to when I was in school and what I studied. Does it have anything to do with what I'm doing now? Really? And I say that honestly, that lifelong learning is something that's a requirement. I'm sure there's a study out there that says that your degree is no longer really relevant after 5 years or something along those lines. So how do we build an educational system whereby we can sort of attach these badging, micro-credentialing, continuing education components to really encourage that ongoing apprenticeship? Because I don't know about you, but I can only speak from just my own professional experiences that some of those best situations are when you have a very senior person and you bring in that diversity of thought with a new, and when I say new, not necessarily just junior, just new to the industry view, and that's where a lot of the magic really happens from a learning standpoint. I mean, putting aside sort of traditional formal education.
There are people who say that everybody should go to law school, not because we need more lawyers, heaven forbid, but because they teach an analytical approach that is useful in a lot of different fields. Final question from me is, and Charles alluded to this in his report, but it's something that maybe we can spend a couple minutes on, is a lot of the kids is the wrong word, but a lot of the young people in the city that are going through this process and trying to find work have a lot of other challenges in their lives that make this more complicated. They may be single parents, they have financial obligations, they may have student loans at some level, they may have healthcare issues, they may have childcare issues. In some areas, they probably have transportation issues. They may want find a job, but it's 30 miles away, and they don't have a car. So these are all things that get in the way of a smooth path. Are these things that programs that we've been talking about ought to address, or are these are just speed bumps on life's road that people need to overcome on their own?
Certainly I think that these are, like these kinds of wraparound services, we definitely saw a number of the institutions we spoke to focused on that. I think in particular, it creates a great opportunity to sort of have a win-win for the individuals themselves, as well as for business and for the economy as a whole. I think one example that was really great was when we went to Pittsburgh. The University of Pittsburgh had relocated, essentially their whole additive manufacturing work and into a former, I think, Westinghouse factory. That also, like some of the levels of that are either makerspace or rented out to various other small businesses. But they definitely spoke about the challenges of, okay, so yeah, you're in a disadvantaged part of Pittsburgh, and if somebody comes in the door and receives some training and is able to get connected to an employer, they may be 30, 40 minutes, an hour out of town, and can that person actually access that job? And that's bigger than just, sometimes I feel like that is a bigger problem than we're just discussing here. Sometimes it's easier to take off the smaller bite, but until you take on that, you're gonna leave a lot of people, on the sidelines who aren't going to be able to take advantage of the opportunities of this, technological revolution. And you see when they do get those kind of opportunities, they can really improve both their neighborhood, both their area, and honestly be an asset to their employers, and to it's a win-win situation.
I was just going to say that there are a lot of, you asked about the programs. If you're serious about the partnerships and the collaboration, and even within the local workforce development boards, there are resources available there to provide for transportation, because you're correct, lots of times the employment opportunities are not where people live. And in many cases, particularly in smaller communities, there's not public transportation that's going to be available. So transportation, childcare needs to be mentioned as well. There may be counseling sessions for substance abuse. All of these things, there are ways to coordinate resources for people, because you can't learn if you don't have a home, or you can't feed your kids, and you can't get to the job. So all of those things, I think, are part of a solution. People don't have just a single problem or a single challenge or a single opportunity. So,
Is this something you've encountered?
It is, and I think that's the real part of it. The real part of it is that I think we all understand and can acknowledge that student opportunity is not equal. And it sometimes is a geographic thing, sometimes it's a socioeconomic thing, and oftentimes urban is the same as rural. You hit some of those same challenges in those two environments. And so I think that is a great strategy, is looking for those resources, because this is the intersection of workforce development meets economic development. Right. And oftentimes when you put those people around the table, which is one of the things we really try to do, is put everyone at the table, so that when we identify those hurdles, we have the right folks that can identify the resource that's there, because there are resources that can help and be successful. And a lot of times it's, I think we've said it a number of times, they just don't know what they don't know, unless we're talking about it to identify it, and really having that conduit to have the conversation, to make those connections and network to the answers or solutions to those problems is key.
Yeah. And I'll just say, I know, the one thing in that vein that HP is funding through our foundation is the creation of an additive manufacturing 101 textbook. That is an open educational resource. So really acknowledging our role and being able to help provide some of those open resources. It's not going to fix everything, but it can certainly take little slices. And I think the other one too is, and I wouldn't underestimate this, as we build these collaborative hands-on spaces, that's people coming together with other people. One thing, again, I go back, what I studied in school was psychology, actually. I wanted to be a counselor. The social, the psychological safety that those environments could bring, the help, the mentorship, I wouldn't underestimate that as we really focus in on that community piece, not just the technology piece, that there could be some really good programs that could spring out of that as well too, to answer some of these really tough, wicked sort of challenges.
I think, and that highlights the ultimate piece, which is the mentor opportunity of a student seeing another student, I say student of any age, a student seeing another student that's successful, right? And that is different from everyone. It could be the clothes you wear, the car you drive, the way you conduct yourself, the people you're with, whatever it may be. Those pinpoints are different for everyone. But I think that community piece is definitely
huge.
And I'll have to say, though, I was at the MIT Solve event, and there was one of the professors that was there was talking about a study where they tried to use data and AI to optimize bus routes, so kids that were coming from these communities that were farther away weren't spending as much time on the buses. And you know what's interesting? They solved the problem from a technology standpoint, but then the parents complained, and then they dug into the why were they getting pushback on this? You're not spending, it's because the kid was safe while they were on the bus, as opposed to being in their neighborhood where they were not safe. And so I think that, again, looking creatively at how we can support some of those dynamics. Is there a way that you can incorporate your learning with your travels? I don't know. Really trying to think out of the box on how to solve that.
That's interesting. I would never have thought of that.
Yeah. I'll have to dig that out. For anyone who's interested, I'll find the actual link to the study.
Yeah,
because
I'd
that
be
was just a
interested.
really good one where best intentions, but
Kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah.
All right, let's turn to the audience and see if there's a question. Right here on the right side, there's a microphone coming. Please do two things. Tell us who you are and ask a question.
Okay. I'm Roy Swift. I'm the Executive Director of WorkBased, which is an affiliate of the American National Standards Institute. And we just completed a study about a year ago. Somebody's nodding your head, so I'm glad that you saw it, which agrees about the lack of communication. There may be communication, but it may not be the right thing. And secondly, there is a major difference between the large manufacturer and the small and medium, and we probably can't talk about it as an but my question, I do have a question. One of the things that we realized is the certification community, the industry, and Josh, I know and actually HP, is talked about a lot as being one of the answers, and certainly deals with the micro-credential issue, because the certification community doesn't appear, it meets more of the large versus the medium and small. Was there any discussion in your study about the use of certifications and their lack of appropriateness, and how we might be able to move that community? Because I noticed your recommendations was about education and industry, and unfortunately certification does not get mentioned a lot in these discussions.
I think certification is definitely, it's something that was talked about, and we found that it was something that, especially I think the educational institutions were chomping at the bit to have more of that. And I noticed, slightly a little bit more reluctance from, I think, the employer side of things, that a lot of times employers felt like, oh, well, our process is too specific, or either it's the paperwork, or we don't feel like this provides value to us. And so it really, I think that the challenge is making sure that the certifications are relevant and can actually be applied to the work that the employer is doing, and at the same time have to be, portable and digestible for the employee and the worker themselves. And getting that kind of overlap is, I think, a sweet spot that a lot of institutions are working at, but it's not.
It's hard.
It's a tough nut to crack, and I think that's a challenge that a lot of institutions are facing.
We had another one on this side, which, over there. Well, you're first here, then we'll go over there.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Treadgold. I work for EMD Group, which is a life science and applied materials manufacturing company. Thank you for the discussion this morning. My question is specifically about apprenticeships. Being here in Washington, D.C., it seems if you talk about workforce development and apprenticeships, someone from the German embassy will say, well, the German apprenticeship model is the best in the world. The Swiss embassy, some person will say the Swiss model is the best. Other countries will have their own models as well. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. Are there big differences between apprenticeship programs that you've seen in the U.S. and those that are based explicitly on sort of those foreign models? And if so, have you seen difficulties in applying apprenticeship programs based on foreign models here in the U.S. because of differences in systems or anything like that? Thank you.
Who wants to go? Jerry?
I've seen that over in Germany as well. There are differences. And I think that there's also a difference in attitude by business and parents and students about what an apprenticeship certification is. And it is held in very, very high esteem in those countries. In particular in Switzerland, they're equal. If you're a college, university graduate or an apprenticeship graduate, it makes no difference. That's not the case in the United States. There also is, there are decisions, there's a lot of decision making on younger individuals in school in those countries, where they start into a pathway, if you will. And I think that's been a criticism and concern in the United States, that nobody wants a United States kid to say in 7th grade, oh, this is what I want to do, because we all know everybody's mind changes many times. And if you're not exposed to the range of occupations, you don't know what the opportunities are. On the other hand, the last time I was over there, I met 2 apprentices in a manufacturing company. Was very fine precision tooling. Both had their university degrees and had come back to be apprentices. One in interior design and another one in manufacturing. So what I was seeing was an dual apprenticeship program that was trying to loosen up a little bit and be more flexible. And we have always tried to maintain here a flexibility with some balance in structure. So I think that's a long answer, but those are some of the differences.
I should say, we did not send Charles to either Switzerland or Germany, and we did not make an attempt to compare this to foreign programs.
I had to make plastic spoons.
Yeah. I was going to say, you really hit on it with the brand comment, though, because I do think it is a branding issue here. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the remarks. They're very interesting. I'm Bill Hederman from the University of Pennsylvania and at the CSIS Energy Program. But I came today because I'm also a co-founding commissioner of the Collegiate Robotics Football Conference. And this is largely based in the Rust Belt of the Midwest. It's got two big tent poles, the Naval Academy and Notre Dame, but the other schools are vocationally oriented engineering programs in Ohio and Indiana. And there's been great success with the experiential learning with it and with the cool factor of they do a lot of outreach to STEM meetings at their local schools, et cetera. But the smaller programs are having real difficulties sustaining their funding, and they've tried to find places and they're not finding it. So your comments about where to find it, I just wondering, is there some, like within even specifically Indiana and Ohio, where an engineering program doing something like this should be looking for help, because it looks like they're going to need help in the next few years?
And Indiana is a particularly interesting example, in part because their community college system is a single statewide system. And I think that creates some benefits for them in our conversations. It also, I think, creates some challenges for them. And I think one of the challenges that perhaps you're experiencing is that sometimes you have to make, frankly, a business case of here's the value proposition that's going to pay a return. And I think we saw this in a few conversations about even the maker spaces, that a lot of times it's hard to measure that value proposition. And you can see it, you can realize when you have those kinds of activities, the value it pays is that excitement and that opportunity. Frankly, it's a giant billboard for future students to say, here's an opportunity path for you to follow. But then it's hard to sort of then capture that as a value. And I think the part of the challenge that we're going to face is even with those kinds of spaces, even with those kinds of programs, because the focus on so many of our K-12 education STEM programs are so exclusively focused towards, okay, if you get this STEM education, well, obviously you've got to go on and become an engineer. You've got to go on and work on this for your degree. And I think the opportunity with those kinds of programs is to sort of broaden your base a little bit and say, okay, yes, robotics can lead to an engineering degree, but it can also be a path to a job right now that, yes, you can still continue to learn and you can still, continue to work towards degrees, but you can also get, various other kinds of credentials along the way, and you don't have to take this either or approach. And I think the challenge is, frankly, to your point about, getting funding for it, you sometimes have to make a grant business case for here's the value that it pays back. And so I think, where you've seen those be successful, it's because there's somebody who's very passionate about it and says, okay, in this local area, we're going to commit to this, even though we know it's going to be hard to show the value. You have to show the value in other ways. So I don't know if anybody else.
No, I was going to say I agree with that, because I don't think it's, usually you'll have, Josh, you brought this up early on too, the passionate individual, the four elements that you described for success, and I think that applies to your case. I think I really say that going back to really trying to work on the ROI. What are you trying to do? In business, everything comes down to what are your metrics, what are your success, what's the outcome? Try to work back from that. I think I would love to see more, again, how do we bridge the industry and some of these programs? What's the low-hanging fruit, where it's easy to support? Because I think oftentimes too, and I'll just speak from putting on sort of my business hat, when approached by many different organizations, trying to understand which ones really connect to your overall mission and goals, I think that's half the battle. And so, again, finding that right combination that you described around the passionate person who can really write the grant, who can help pull it together, but then also is able to quantify it in a way that attracts local businesses as well.
Okay, I think we have one more, and then we're going to say the time is up.
Hello, my name is Jeff Wheeler. I'm from the Solidarity Center, which is an affiliate of the American Federation of Labor. at the beginning of your presentation, you discussed the perceptions problem and the barriers that young people face or people looking for opportunities face in becoming part of these training programs. And I was wondering if you encountered any information about other barriers, particularly gender and cost. Are there particular challenges in getting women and girls interested in these training programs? And what financial decisions do people need to make if they want to pursue this path? And what are we doing to help address those obstacles to close the skills gaps?
So, do you want to speak to this, or
Go-
I can jump in?
All right, I'll go ahead. And then I'll,
I think, yes, I think there definitely is a challenge. There's a perception problem that manufacturing, not only is it dirty and these old factory floors, and it's a very, you need to be a big, brawny man is the only person who's able to do this. And that's not the case at all. Like, when you're dealing with a robotic arm that's going to lift something, you need somebody who can think on their feet and can repair it. You don't need somebody who can actually lift the car door, because that's what the robot arm is doing. And I think the programs that I saw really focus on that, saw the value of it, and could actually make a return on investment. That a lot of companies see their mission as making sure that they are focused on diversity, and so they appreciate the local organizations that are also doing that. So I think several organizations had boot camps that were particularly targeted towards women or to other subgroups, in part because you could build a little bit more of that, you could fight a little bit more of that perception problem in those kinds of environments. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to do more of. And I do think that also goes back a little bit to some of the wraparound services that we spoke about a little bit earlier, that especially when it comes to other communities that have been disadvantaged in various ways, you've got to, as an institution, make an extra effort to reach out to them. So the way the University of Pittsburgh, located in a disadvantaged area and is reaching out to minority communities and to, frankly, to other people that you wouldn't think, belong in a manufacturing perception, you've got to actively go out and reach out into those communities. You can't just wait for people to come into you.
no, I would just add, we all need to see ourselves in whatever is going forward, whether it's an occupation or a learning situation or whatever. And to the extent that young women and young people of color don't see themselves in the pre-apprenticeship or the company job shadowing or the reaching out, that presents a challenge. So it's been exciting to talk to some of the companies and organizations where they're actually sending out the younger apprentices to speak to, if I can use the term kids in high school and in middle school who are closer in age and who provide a model for them to see the opportunities. So I think that is an important thing we need to keep in mind.
Which gets back to the peer group issue that Josh mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we are out of time. We are past time. Please thank the panel for their. Appreciate you're all coming. I hope you get a copy of this, and we'll be happy to follow up, as would they, if you have any further questions.